The late June sun dipped below the horizon as our group of five, laden with backpacks and youthful optimism, trekked into the dense forest that bordered our college town. It was a rite of passage, a final adventure before our senior year began. I, Alex, led the way with an eager stride, flanked by Jenna, with her sun-kissed hair and adventurous spirit. Mark, the ever-joking, broad-shouldered history major. Sarah, whose quiet demeanor masked an unwavering resolve. And Tom, my childhood friend, whose laughter could lighten even the darkest woods. Our laughter and chatter echoed through the trees, a stark contrast to the solemn stillness of the forest. As night enveloped us, we found a clearing and set up camp under a canopy of stars, the fire's glow warding off the chill of the night and the shadows between the trees. Our conversations, filled with plans and dreams, drifted into the night, until one by one we retreated into our tents, the excitement of the day giving way to exhaustion. The first hint that something was amiss came with the morning light. Footprints, not belonging to any of us, encircled our campsite, weaving between the tents and disappearing back into the woods. Unease settled over the group as we gathered around the dying embers of last night's fire. Mark tried to joke about it, suggesting squirrels on steroids, but his laughter rang hollow in the heavy air. We decided to push deeper into the forest, attributing the footprints to a curious hiker or a local messing with tourists. The woods seemed to close in around us, the trees more oppressive, the silence more profound. Our conversations dwindled as we navigated through thick underbrush and overgrown paths, the sense of isolation growing with every step. As dusk approached, disorientation took hold. Landmarks we had passed hours earlier reappeared, mocking our efforts to press forward. Panic simmered beneath my calm facade, my mind racing to find a rational explanation. Sarah's voice, usually so calm, cracked as she asked, "Are we lost?" Her question hung in the air, unanswered, as we realized that none of us knew the way back. That night the forest felt alive, sounds magnified in the darkness. Whispers seemed to dance on the wind, and shadows moved just beyond the firelight. Tom's unease was palpable. He kept scanning the trees, a look of foreboding etched on his face. "Something's not right," he muttered, his usual jovial tone replaced by tension. We all felt it, a creeping dread that this place held secrets not meant for us to uncover. As we settled into an uneasy sleep, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of eyes lingering on us from the darkness. The night was restless, filled with half-heard sounds and the sensation of something moving just outside the circle of light. By morning, the tension among us had grown tangible, a silent acknowledgement that this adventure had taken a turn toward something sinister. The morning brought no relief, only a thick fog that seemed to swallow the edges of our campsite, making the trees loom like specters. Our fire had died to cold ashes, and the chill in the air seeped into our bones. We huddled around a meager breakfast, speaking in hushed tones, as if afraid to disturb the ominous quiet of the forest. The decision to break camp and find our way back was unanimous. Yet, as we packed, an undercurrent of fear pulsed through me. The footprints from the previous morning were joined by new ones, identical in size and pattern, encircling our sight in a silent testament to the night's unseen visitors. Jenna's eyes met mine, her usual vibrancy dimmed by fear. "We're not alone out here," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rustling leaves. As we set out, the forest seemed to press in on us, the fog distorting our senses and direction. Mark took the lead, compass in hand, but the dense woods rendered it nearly useless. Our progress was painstakingly slow, the sense of being watched growing with every step. The occasional snap of a twig or rustle of leaves had us spinning, eyes scanning the impenetrable mist for a sign of anything or anyone. By midday, our situation had grown desperate. Sarah, always the voice of reason, proposed marking our path with slashes on the trees, a futile attempt to combat the disorientation. Yet, as we trudged on, those very markers seemed to mock us, appearing where they shouldn't have been, leading us in circles. The turning point came with Tom's disappearance. One moment he was behind us, and the next, gone, swallowed by the fog. Panic erupted, our calls for him swallowed by the forest. The search was frantic, each of us splitting up, calling his name, the unity we once shared shattered by fear. Hours passed with no sign of Tom. The realization that we were truly lost, trapped in a malevolent wilderness that seemed to delight in our torment, was paralyzing. When we regrouped, the loss of our friend hung between us, a palpable thing. Accusations flew, fear and frustration boiling over until Jenna's scream pierced the air, drawing our attention to the ground before us. Tom's camera, dropped or discarded, lay in the dirt, its lens cracked, the last vestige of our friend. The decision to keep moving was driven by desperation, a shared delusion that motion equaled progress. Night fell again, a night darker and more fraught with terror than the last. Our fire was a beacon of false hope, flickering in the relentless darkness. Whispers filled the air, unintelligible yet sinister, a cacophony of voices that seemed to revel in our despair. Sleep was fleeting, filled with nightmares that leached from the very soil beneath us. The third day dawned, if you could call the slight lightening of the oppressive gloom a dawn. Our situation had become dire. The loss of Tom had fractured the group, leaving a void that was filled with suspicion and fear. We moved through the forest, a shell of the vibrant group that had entered, our steps heavy with the weight of our grim reality. The forest seemed to change around us, trees warping into grotesque shapes, their branches clawing at the sky. Mark, who had taken to muttering to himself, suddenly stopped, his eyes wide with terror. "Do you hear that?" he asked, his voice a thin thread of sanity. We listened, and in the distance, a faint melody played, a luring tune that had no place in this wilderness. The sound twisted in the air, both inviting and menacing, compelling yet repelling. We moved on, driven by an unspoken agreement that to follow would be madness. Our provisions dwindled, and with them, our hope. Jenna's once bright eyes were now dulled, her movements mechanical. Sarah tried to keep us together, her leadership a thin veneer over her own despair. I felt a darkness growing within me, a whisper in my mind that urged me to embrace the forest, to become one with its twisted paths. Then Sarah vanished. One moment she was beside us, the next simply gone, as if the forest had inhaled her very essence. Our search was half-hearted. We had lost too much, the belief in survival dimmed to a mere flicker. That night, the fire seemed to offer no warmth, the darkness encroaching on our circle of light with malevolent intent. The whispers were louder now, voices that promised an end to our suffering if we would just step into the shadows. Jenna and Mark huddled together, their whispers a counterpoint to the ones that filled the air. I sat apart, the darkness within me growing, finding a strange kinship with the malevolence that surrounded us. In a moment of clarity, or perhaps madness, I understood. The forest didn't want us to leave. It had chosen us, or more accurately, chosen me. The realization was a relief, a release from the fear and despair. I stood, moving to the edge of the light, and looked into the shadows. There, in the darkness, I saw them, shapes not quite human, beckoning. I turned back to my remaining friends, their faces gaunt in the firelight, and I knew what I had to do. The forest's whispers had become commands, a purpose given to end our collective nightmare. As they slept, I acted, a servant to the darkness that had claimed me. When dawn broke, I was alone, the last of us, surrounded by the silence of the forest. Alone now, the forest around me seemed to breathe with a life of its own, an entity that had consumed those I once called friends. The realization of my actions came not with horror, but with an eerie acceptance. I had become an instrument of the forest's will, a part of its dark essence. The whispers were now my companions, guiding me deeper into its heart. The days blurred together, time measured only by the light and dark cycles of the forest's canopy. Food and water were no longer concerns. The forest provided, nurturing its chosen. I wandered without purpose, or perhaps my purpose was simply to be. One morning, or what I perceived as morning, I stumbled upon a clearing unlike any other part of the forest. Here, the trees were ancient, their trunks wide as houses, their branches high above, forming a natural cathedral. The ground was covered in a soft luminescent moss that cast an ethereal glow. In the center of this clearing stood a stone, its surface smooth and inscribed with symbols that pulsed with a faint light. As I approached, the air around me thickened, charged with an energy that prickled my skin. The whispers crescendoed, a cacophony of voices that urged me forward. My hands reached out, touching the stone, and in that moment a flood of understanding washed over me. The forest, this ancient being, had been dying, its essence fading. It needed a guardian, a keeper of its heart. My friends' unwitting sacrifices had fueled its rebirth, and I was to be its sentinel. The knowledge was a burden, but also a gift. I saw the forest for what it truly was, a living, breathing entity, ancient beyond measure, filled with a wisdom and malice born of its long existence. It had chosen me, not because of any inherent goodness or strength, but because of the darkness within me that mirrored its own. I lived in the shadow of that realization, my existence intertwined with the forest. Hikers and campers would occasionally wander close, and I, like the guardian I had become, would lead them astray, keeping the heart of the forest safe from those who would unwittingly harm it. I became a myth, a ghost story whispered around campfires, the monster in the woods.